Why did he choose the lowly bird? Because he loved me so. He loved me so. He loved me so. He gave his precious life for me, because he loved me so. Why did he drink the bitter cup of sorrow, pain, and woe? Why on the cross be lifted up? Because he loved me so. He loved me so. He loved me so. He gave his precious life for me, because he loved me so. Till Jesus comes, I'll sing his praise, and then to glory go, and reign with him through endless days, because he loved me so. He loved me so. He loved me so. He gave his precious life for me, because he loved me so. So Brother Nathan asked me to teach the class this week, and you need to continue to pray for Nathan. He's going through some health issues, and he's a good guy. We really need to help him if we can. So I don't know if this is 1 week or 2 weeks or what it will be. And I enjoy studying the Word, and Daniel 5 is one of my favorites. One of the things I do when I study the Bible, I try to get in context what's going on. And between Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, there's a big gap. It doesn't really indicate that in the Scripture, but you come up with a new king and a new situation. And so I did a little research, and what's so interesting is that Babylon is thoroughly documented in archaeology. If you ever get a chance, if you ever find this in print again, buy this book. It's called the Archaeological Study Bible. And what it has in it, it has the text of the Bible, but then it has all the archaeological discoveries that refer or respond or, correspond to the passages. So interesting. So I did a little digging there, a little digging here. Come to find out that there were 3 historians that are not biblically related, Xenophon, Herodias, and Bersius, who documented, along with the Babylonian cylinder, all the things that happened in Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar died. There was a struggle for power. And so the first, son, he might have been a concubine's son, but his name was Evil Merodach. He's mentioned in the book of Chronicles. He survived and worked in Babylon for 2 years. Then you had Neriglissar. He was in there for about 4 years. And then somebody assassinated him, and he lasted 9 months. And then you come up with Nabonidus, which was actually Nebuchadnezzar's legitimate son, but sort of down the line. And his son Belshazzar is the one who's reigning at this time. Now Nabonidus was an interesting guy. He didn't really want to be any kind of a king or regent or anything. He liked archaeology. So he was out doing archaeological stuff, and he let Belshazzar be the regent in Babylon, and that's how we come up with Belshazzar. And apparently Belshazzar was a party kid, and everybody liked him because, hey, let's party. I mean, there's no real adult in charge here. So that's the situation that we find in Babylon. And so that really sort of leads me to Daniel's situation. Now, Daniel was highly revered and respected in Nebuchadnezzar's court. And when you have a court, it's sort of like your little dominion. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, went through that period of time when he lost his mind and was out eating grass like an ox. But the court stayed strong because they were highly respected by the society and they kept things together. Daniel was part of that. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar died, there's always a change in leadership. And when there's a change in leadership, as you know, what happens? Well, the new king comes in, wipes everybody out, takes everybody out so he can have his own court. Well, this did not happen with Daniel. And I attribute that to God's providence. God took care of Daniel. And he also went through 4 different emperors, regents, whatever, and he survived that whole time. Of course, he was very old by now. So Daniel was probably, 16 or 17 when he was taken into Babylonian captivity. There was a 70-year promise that God would restore the children of Israel to Palestine. So we're looking at a guy at least 80-something, okay? So apparently he wasn't in active service when this situation happened. So I wanted you to get that in mind, that an 80-something prophet who had survived all the political intrigue leading to this moment was called to do something on the spot in front of a party governor, a party, he was sort of co-regent with his father who was out still fighting Cyrus. And so I can imagine his attitude, and you'll remember his attitude when he makes comments as that goes along. But the third thing that I picked up from this was that when God makes a promise, he protects his people. He protects his people. And we'll find out in Daniel 6 what that applies to. So let's go ahead and read it like I always do. And this way we get it in our minds so we can think about it. I'll point out a few things as we go along that'll help you understand Daniel's situation. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. This was not just isolated to the king and his court and the nobles. This was like a nationwide celebration of Marduk. Marduk was a false god, of course, but he was supposed to be the paternal god for Babylon. Everybody was partying this night. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, meaning his forefather, had taken from the temple of Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Now you know, right, that they weren't just drinking wine, right? This was like a major orgy kind of situation, all right. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster on the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. Now, I guess what's going through his mind was, am I really that drunk? What is that? His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and will have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." So this reference to third highest implies that Belshazzar was not number one. His dad was number one. He was out still fighting. He was number two. I'll make you next in charge after me. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and all his nobles, came to the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king calls Belteshazzar, was found to have keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So the queen, in these little assemblies, was not usually part of the festivities because she was a royalty and she sort of stayed aloof from these kind of things. But she heard about the problem. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the Spirit of God is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems." So Daniel, if I understand old people, and I'm getting there, probably was in bed asleep when all this happened. Hey, the king wants you. So he's getting himself together as he's being drugged before the king, right? And he's wondering, what in the world? I mean, he hasn't called me in all these years. What's the deal? "If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." So, what does a grouchy old man say when he's pulled out of bed in the middle of the night? Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor." I'm just thinking, as a preacher, sometimes I realize that I'll be called to speak to certain people. But the worst people in the world to talk to are drunk people. They don't care. They're making fun of you. They're laughing. They're joking. But apparently this was not the case in this situation. They were all at rapt attention at what Daniel was saying because they see something on the wall that's not part of their delirium. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Have you ever had that sinking feeling in your heart that, uh-oh, I'm done for? You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. You did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. And what is so cool about this? I'm just telling you. This is an accounting term. This is what Daniel did all his life. You see, Daniel was a chief tax collector. He was the administrator of getting all the taxes to the king that were due the king. And this is part of an accounting formula. All right? It means counting, found vacant, found, what's the word when you're not where you need to be in accounting? A deficit. Deficit found, removed. Because what happened in this accounting situation that Daniel was very understanding of, if you count again, you found a delinquency, that's it, a delinquency, and you remove, that means that you take that person away from their property because it was kind of a property tax, a citizenship tax. Okay? And this is what it was. This is what these words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. You see, what's so cool is that this is already happening right now. The historians say that the king coming up, Cyrus the Persian, has already diverted the Euphrates River. What's so neat about all this is that people thought that the kingdom of Babylon was completely protected in every way. They had walls that were 150 feet thick, 75 feet high, and there was a water source that flowed through the city. So an army could not come and break down the walls without a long period of punishment. And they couldn't cut off their water supply because it was the river Euphrates flowing through their town. There's no way they could keep them from getting to water. But guess what this king did? He went and he made a channel. First he dug a channel away from the Euphrates River downstream, upstream. And then he blocked off the Euphrates and caused it to go through this channel. So everybody in their drunken stupor didn't notice that the river was going down and almost dry. And the army came in on the riverbed. And that's why there was no real fighting, because everybody just didn't realize what was happening. And Belshazzar was killed that night. And it was a complete turnover in government without much bloodshed. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed third highest ruler in the kingdom. The king really didn't do Daniel a favor at this moment because he was going to be deposed that very night. So what do you usually do? Well, you go and you cut down the king, you cut down all his officials. But Daniel was protected by God. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius was probably a high-ranking general that took over for Cyrus. Cyrus was in another place fighting another battle. Later on, Cyrus came in and they established his own kingdom. Darius stepped down. And Cyrus then was the promise from God that he would allow God's people to go back and re-inhabit Jerusalem and reestablish Judaism in their hometown. So, now we've had time to think about it. Let's go over it again. Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. What was that like? What do you think that was? That was a proclamation not only that the God that protected Babylon was great, and we ought to celebrate that we are in a secure position, but how foolish he was. The whole city was in that kind of mindset, that kind of, I don't know. I don't think I've ever gotten drunk before, even though I tasted alcohol. Stupor is a good word. When people get in a drunken stupor, they really just don't care, do they? What's going on? They're just excited about that. And the whole town was celebrating Marduk and his power. He was drinking his wine, thinking everything was fine. It just sort of, came to me that it seems like we're all in our own little world sometimes. And as long as I have my coffee, as long as I have my job, as long as my mortgage is paid, as long as I'm driving down the road and everything's in fine repair, I'm in my own little world, and my own little world tells me I'm doing good. And we can sort of block out the troubles of the world, right? We can sort of block out what's going on with our brother-in-law or with our neighbor down the street, or what's happening in Mexico, or what's happening other places in the world. Didn't that just break your heart when you found out the guy that we support in Mexico, a doctor, a preacher, just died? His wife is left to continue the mission there. Just thinking how wonderful it is that we're putting together Christmas packages. Something we do every year. I just thought, wow, I think we sort of missed the point here. So we're in our own little world. Of course, Belshazzar was in his own little world. And he made a bad decision. Bad decision. Let's go and get all the ceremonially important and significant items that we took out of Jerusalem to show how great our God is over that God. And there was some display going on. Where do these beautiful cups come from? What's going on here? Oh, Marduk the Great delivered these items into our hand. He was more powerful than the God of Israel. And everybody drank. And they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, and stone. Suddenly, I think God had it up to here. You ever hear that expression? When I was growing up, my dad would say, I've had it up to here. And that meant it was bad news. Because I've had it up to here, and I'm not going to take it anymore, and we're going to change things. Well, God said, I've had it up to here. I'm going to not going to send a prophet. I'm not going to send somebody to slap you around. I'm going to scare you to death. So he sent a hand, and it started writing on the plaster near the wall, exactly where the king's eyes were focused. Sometimes the Word of God does that to you, doesn't it? You're studying the Word and you're in your own little world and you're trying to find something, and then something opens your eyes and your perceptions and you realize that Your situation was not as secure as you thought it was. Maybe you think that your good works will make it to the throne of heaven and you'll be surely inducted into heaven. And you think, wow, my good works aren't going to put me in heaven. It's what Jesus did for me. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. I think maybe the king was standing up when this happened, and he needed to sit down. The king called out, enchanters, astrologers, diviners, come. Tell me what's up. What's going on? What is this? Did you do this? What is this? How could this happen? Marduk is protecting us. What is this? He didn't understand it. And then he makes one of those proud boasts. Like, whoever can read this, I'll give them a chain, I'll give them a cloak, and I'll make them third in the kingdom. You remember any other king that did that? To a daughter, maybe? Remember what she asked for? The head of John the Baptist on a platter. Drunken stupors. Then all the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. They were motivated. Oh yeah, don't you want a gold chain? Yeah. Don't you want to be third in the kingdom? Yeah. What could this mean? And you know, for a long time they probably worked it out, and they probably looked in their documents and looked in any kind of history and don't know, king. So the king became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. It sort of changed the whole spirit of this little engagement, didn't it? Seemed like everybody was, in a sense, terrified of what happened. The queen came and offered a solution. I know a guy. He was one of Nebuchadnezzar's finest men. Go and get Daniel. He'll tell you what's it all about.
Is this minutes, hours, days, years?
That night.
That's all happened in one night?
One night. A lot of things can happen in one night. But what was so cool is they would have had to have been working on this little project a week before to divert the whole Euphrates River. And so this was D-Day. This was bam time. I did want to look at the description of Daniel, who is sort of been put on the shelf because he's so old. And the Babylonians really didn't know what to do with old people because they didn't have them. Because they lived such a life that their lives, their life expectancy for a man in that time was maybe 45 or 50. This guy was 70, almost 80. There's a man. He has the spirit of the holy gods in him. He has insight, intelligence, wisdom like that of the gods. He's got a keen mind, knowledge, understanding, ability to interpret dreams. So they called for Daniel. So Daniel was brought before the king, and he was asked, "Are you Daniel?" Which tells me that this king had not availed himself of Daniel's wisdom up to this point. Daniel was put aside, put away, put in the back. Are you one of those exiles my father brought back from Judah? I have heard that you have the Spirit of God's, that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. Here's our situation. Could you solve this problem for us? If you can read this writing, he made the promise, third highest in the kingdom. Daniel had a way with words. He was trying to tell the king, I'm not really interested in your rewards, king, but I am interested in the truth. I'll tell you what it means. And then he gives the king a little Bible study. Give him a little history, because that was the job of these wise men back in the day, to advise kings about the history that went before them, about the peoples that they were trying to conquer, about the peoples that were in their kingdom, about the trouble they would have subduing those people. And Daniel knew about that. So I want you to listen to how Daniel described his situation. O King, the Most High God. Have you ever studied the name of God? Have you in the Old Testament? You know, in the Old Testament, the number one challenge for the children of Israel was to believe that their God was the only God. Hear, O Israel, our God is one. Everywhere they went, the Egyptians had like 2,000 gods. The Canaanites had more. The Greeks had even more, and even wrote comic books about them. The Romans stole the gods from the Greeks. And there were gods everywhere, but God insisted, I am the God. I am your God. You are my children. You've got to believe that I'm the only one. And every time, if you look in the Bible, every time that Israel went into a situation where there were many gods, God would stand up and he would embarrass the other gods. Remember the 10 plagues? Every one of those plagues was to embarrass one of the gods of Egypt. Same thing happened in Canaan. Remember the contest on Carmel? Remember Baal had his, I always get the numbers mixed up, James. Was it like 450 prophets? And the prophet of God came up and said, hey, let's have a little challenge here. Right? You guys, if your guy is God, then we'll follow him. If our guy is God, we'll follow him, right? We'll do that, yeah? Okay. Bring fire down from heaven to consume your sacrifice. Remember? What did they do? I like studying that. You know what they did to try to wake their God up to come and answer? They would cut themselves. They would dance around, you know, and sling blood into the air. Remember what the prophet said? Maybe he's on vacation. Cry louder. And I think the Hebrew says maybe he's in the bathroom. He'll be out in a minute. Just keep yelling. He'll come out. Nothing happened. The people saw that and they realized nothing happened. Baal did not come. And then as soon as the prophet got all the stones, and he didn't use any graven stones, as soon as he set up the stones and he put his sacrifice on there, he said, you know, this is going to be too easy. Bring some water. And they dumped water on it, right? Have you ever tried starting a fire with dry wood? You have to, it takes a little effort, right? With dry wood. How hard is it with wet wood? And he said, you know, that's still too easy. Bring some more water. Do you remember that? And you could imagine how these other prophets were just wilting as he was doing this. Like, what in the world is this guy doing? And then he prayed a simple prayer, and fire came from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, consumed the wood, consumed the stones, and the dirt around it. God has always stepped up when his children were thinking about going to other gods. He's always stepped up. This is so cool. My God, the Most High God, gave your father sovereignty and greatness, glory and splendor, and he protected it. Because of his high position, he gave him all the peoples and nations of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, remember he said, look at this great Babylon that I've created. Remember, that was the last straw for him. He was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. I shouldn't say this. But you know, when the Israelites were rounded up by Hitler and put in concentration camps, you know what they fed them? They went out and they cut the grass and they boiled the grass for them to eat. It's sad. You don't get much out of grass. I just wonder if was part of God's plan to show them, hey, you need to humble yourself. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets them over anyone he wishes. Now that was Nebuchadnezzar, the great Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned 60, more than any other Babylonian king because he was protected by God. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. So obviously he did have some education about Nebuchadnezzar, his grandpa. But he never did take on Nebuchadnezzar's love for the God of Israel. And you read in Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar says you need to focus on the God of Israel. Didn't do it. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. If you ever read Isaiah, you'll see how Isaiah highlights this. And Isaiah said one time about the gods, he said, so a man goes out and he cuts down a tree, and he portions out the tree, and some of the wood he puts in his fire to keep himself warm, and some of the wood he builds a house with, and some of the wood he builds a god with. Remember, living in your own little world. You did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. That's what we should take from chapter 5. If God wants us to live and prosper because we are his children, then that's what will happen. If we serve him and we love him with all our heart, he will certainly take care of us. You must believe that. Daniel believed that. He knew that God was punishing his nation, but he needed some people in Babylon, and Daniel was the man, and Daniel served God in a faraway place. So, doesn't the New Testament say that we're just strangers and pilgrims here? Right? This is not our home. Don't we sing that song, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through? If we lived like that, if we lived like Daniel did, we would be looking for something else. We would be looking for a better place. Man, do I love Daniel. The other day I was able to teach the teenagers. I was teaching them about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they were challenged to bow down in front of the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar made. And they said, King, we heard the edict and we heard the music, but we're not going to bow down to your image. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, which God is going to be able to save you from what's about to happen? You know what they said? And we serve a God that can save us from this if he wants to. But even if he doesn't want to, O king, we will not bow down to your image. What the cool thing is, if you study history, that after their exile and return, they never worshiped other gods. God finally got that through their thick little head. Thank you so much.